Hi everyone, and welcome to our first lecture on survey research. This is a really common data collection method. You've probably completed a survey at some point in your life, probably even recently if you take part in course evaluations. So I think you will see how easily this information can be applied to your real life. In this first lecture, I want to talk about the process of survey research. Let's start though with some basic survey terminology. A survey is simply a tool to gather data. In research methods, we call the questions on a survey instrument items. Surveys can be simple with only a few items that go in chronological order, or they can consist of very complex items where responses from one item skip you to a different area of the survey itself. When someone takes the survey, we call them the respondent. It means the same thing as study participant, so you'll hear me use both words interchangeably. Now, survey projects can be completed through two ways. The first is the traditional method, in which a survey questionnaire is put together and provided to the respondent as either a paper hard copy or an online questionnaire. The respondent reads through the survey items and provides their own responses. Surveys can also be done through interviews, though. In a survey interview, the survey questionnaire is read and filled in by the researcher based on the responses from the respondent. Interview surveys are commonly used with complex surveys that have a lot of skipping around because the interviewers can be trained on the complexities of the survey design. There are a lot of advantages to survey research. Surveys are relatively easy to distribute compared to the other research methods, so you tend to see larger and more representative samples in survey research projects. This gives survey research high external validity. Surveys can also be sent out multiple times, so even if someone misses the first survey, then they may complete a follow-up questionnaire. Surveys also afford researchers an opportunity for enhanced privacy. Surveys can be completed by the respondent at their house anonymously, giving privacy to the respondent and promoting more honest responses. Another major advantage to survey research is reliability. Remember that in research methods, reliability is concerned with asking the same questions and getting the same answers. Surveys have structured, recorded items that can be repeated consistently as long as the survey questions are designed well. On the other hand, survey research poses some disadvantages compared to other techniques. The structure of the questions that is so useful for reliability is actually a limitation in terms of validity. Survey questions are designed solely by the researcher, so they don't always focus on the concepts the same way that the respondent would if given more control over the research project. Surveys are also relatively inflexible. Once you've sent out your survey, you can't start changing questions without creating problems during analysis. Although surveys can include qualitative questions, a majority of survey instruments are used to gather quantitative data, so they may struggle with measuring more complex topics. That's why I've highlighted internal validity as a disadvantage of survey research. The way that the researcher provides this respondent with a survey questionnaire is called the mode of distribution. There are 4 modes of distribution: mail surveys, telephone surveys, face-to-face surveys, and online surveys. Each mode of distribution has its own advantages and disadvantages. In the next slide, I'm going to discuss 3 primary concerns that are affected by the distribution mode. The response rate is the ratio of completed surveys to all surveys distributed. To calculate the response rate, you take the number of surveys that were completed and return to the researcher and divide by the total number of surveys distributed. Then you times that number by 100 to get a percent. That percentage represents the percentage of surveys that were completed and returned. Respondent honesty refers to the honesty of the respondent's answers. Because of the stigmatized or illegal nature of some behaviors, respondents may not always be as honest as we would wish when filling out a survey. The distribution mode can influence that, with some modes providing more protection and thus more honesty. Which leads me to the last impact, which is identity protection. The survey mode will affect whether or not a person's identity has to be known by the researcher. In the regular world, we use the terms confidential and anonymous pretty interchangeably, but in research methods, these actually have 2 different meanings. Anonymous means that no one, not even the researcher, can match an individual response to a particular respondent. Most individual level data that's available online is anonymous because the names and the personal information in the data have been replaced by numbers or deleted entirely. So if you download the data set, you have no idea who the participants are and you can't identify what was said about what. Confidential, on the other hand, means that the researcher knows which responses go with which respondent, but the researcher agrees not to reveal their identities to people outside the research study. Confidential research studies often use pseudonyms or fake names so that the participants cannot be identified when they're described in publication. So let's take a look at mail, telephone, and face-to-face surveys. Online surveys are a little different, so I'm going to save those for the next slide. The major advantage of the written and mailed survey is that there's no interviewer at all, so the respondent is more likely to be honest in the survey, even if they're asked for more personal or intimate questions. This lack of interaction with the interviewer also allows for anonymity, as the researcher can take steps to avoid being able to match a particular response with a particular person. For example, in my research, when we wanted to ensure anonymity, we mailed every potential respondent the survey with a completed envelope inside, so they could mail the response back without ever having to put their name, address, or other identifying information on it. Mail surveys have several problems though. Mail surveys can be expensive. At over 50 cents a letter now, just mailing out a simple survey can cost hundreds, even thousands in postage alone, let alone printing and packaging costs. Mail surveys also require the researcher to manually code and input the data, which is a time-consuming process that you'll learn more about in our quantitative data analysis module. Mail surveys also have the lowest response rate of these three methods, which makes sense if you think about the amount of junk mail that you throw away every day without even reading it. There are a lot of surveys that don't even make it to the open envelope stage, and if they do, then the respondent has to remember to mail them back, something that I myself am horrible at. Mail surveys typically have between a 10 and 20% response rate for a one-time mailing, meaning that out of every 10 surveys you send out, you're likely to only get 1 or 2 surveys actually back completed. Now, phone surveys are in between mail and face-to-face. On one hand, they're usually cheaper than mail surveys, and if the researchers use random digit dialing, they can still give the subject anonymity. With today's technology, With today's technology, the interviewers can complete the interview form online while they're talking to the subject. This is called computer-assisted telephone interviewing. Our UT Tyler Center for Opinion Research uses a CATI approach, with students serving as the interviews for various polls. These are actually paid positions, and if you're interested in learning more about this job opportunity, please email me and I can connect you with the center's directors. Something that telephone interviews have over mail interviews is that because the survey requires human interaction, respondents are more likely to complete the survey, which increases the response rate. Also, during the phone interview, the interviewer can clarify questions as needed if the respondent doesn't understand the item. So we get a higher internal validity as compared to mail surveys. The human interaction part, though, is what gives phone surveys a disadvantage. Since there is human interaction involved, respondents may be more influenced to respond certain ways based on the interviewer's presence or verbal communication. This creates what is known as interviewer bias. Interviewer bias may limit the honesty of respondents when asked about more sensitive or intimate topics because they're afraid of being judged, or they think the interviewer would prefer a different answer than their real answer. Phone surveys are also very time-consuming, particularly for longer, more complex surveys, because they must be read aloud to the subject one question at a time. Now, face-to-face is just about the opposite of a mail survey. It's the cheapest option because there's no software or mailing materials required. Like phone surveys, the human interaction allows for clarification and elaboration if needed, which increases the internal validity and increases the response rate. But face-to-face interaction creates even more potential for interviewer bias, and the face-to-face component means that the subject can only be kept confidential, not anonymous. However, the advantage of face-to-face over mail and phone is that the researcher can collect emotional and behavioral information through observation of nonverbal data that cannot be collected in other methods. This also helps improve the internal validity of the study because the researcher can more accurately capture survey responses. Now, that last chart had a lot of information on it, so I wanted to quickly summarize 2 key differences between the 3 modes. Internal validity and response rate both increase as we move towards more intimate human interaction between the researcher and the respondent. Honesty, however, increases as we move away from intimate contact between the researcher and the respondent and towards a more private setting. Online surveys are a mishmash of all three formats, which is why I don't put them on the previous slide. On the positive side, online surveys resemble mail surveys in that they lack human interaction, and so they don't suffer from interviewer bias like face-to-face and phone interviews do. They are also much cheaper than any of the three previous modes because you have several free services available for online distribution. And unlike mailed surveys, online surveys are usually automatically coded and analyzed, which reduces the time it takes for data collection and data analysis. Something that has also given an edge to online survey is the extensive use of survey panels in online research. A survey panel is a pre-existing sample that companies or researchers can pay to access for research purposes. So essentially, a person will sign up for a survey panel and agree to complete a certain number or type of survey across a period of time. If I then pay to use that service as a researcher, that person will be available to complete my survey very quickly. One of the advantages of survey panels is that they're created specifically for research, and so they're going to have more representative characteristics than if you're just trying to find an online sample yourself. Another advantage of online surveys is the use of contingency questions in the survey questionnaire. Remember that mail surveys are not great for complicated questionnaires because the respondents may get confused if there's a bunch of go here, skip this question, go back here, etc. But with online surveys, the software knows that not all questions need to be shown to participants, and it's going to skip the respondent to the appropriate area automatically. For example, if you say you're married, it'll provide the follow-up question of when were you married, but it'll skip that automatically if you say that you're single. These are the contingency questions that you learned about. However, online surveys also have two very serious concerns. One is the accessibility of online surveys. Not everyone is tech savvy or has access to online technology, so some respondent populations may be more or less likely to fill out an online survey. For example, all of you have a college email that you check, or should check, regularly, so getting an email survey to you is pretty simple. However, my grandma still had a Juno email account. Now, if that doesn't clue you in on how technology old school she is, imagine that an online survey for her is like trying to play a virtual reality game through the original PlayStation console. Another issue with online surveys is survey fraud. This means that the participant who signs up for this survey may not actually meet the requirements for the survey. It may be that the respondent wants the chance to earn whatever incentive is being offered for taking the survey, or maybe the respondent is actually trying to mess with the survey data for their own purposes. For instance, a 13-year-old wants to earn money, so she lies about her age, consents to an online survey saying she's 18, and then fills out the survey using her 13-year-old life experiences so that she can earn the Amazon gift card offered at the end of the survey. Her answers are invalid because she doesn't meet the qualifications for the study, but we can't capture that with an online survey as easily as we could with some of the more face-to-face surveys. Another instance of survey fraud would be someone retaking the survey multiple times in order to essentially stack the deck with their responses, or someone who purposely lies about their answers while taking the survey for whatever reason. The last thing I want to cover is the actual process of deployment itself. Most people think that a survey is just write and send, but there's actually a lot more to the process. There are several optional deployment procedures that you can use to increase the validity and reliability of your study. One thing that's commonly used with larger research projects is doing what's called a pilot study. This means that you send out the survey to a small subsection of your population for review. This is a great way to figure out if you've written all of your questions clearly and to assess your survey's reliability before sending it out to your entire sample. This will help you work out any of the kinks involved in the implementation process. Things like how are you going to find the email addresses to send it, or what type of stuffing works best for the envelope. Some deployment procedures are used to increase the response rate of the survey as well. Notification letters are sent before the actual survey is sent out to let people know there is a survey coming. It's basically a heads up. That way you're waiting for the survey and you won't trash it thinking it's junk mail. You can also do several survey deployments, meaning that you send out the invitation to participate several times throughout the study. And if you really want to increase your response rate, you follow up with those participants specifically who did not complete the survey, known as non-response follow-up. The goal of all of this is to ensure that more people complete the study, increasing your sample's representativeness and your study's external validity. Survey processing is the final step, and that occurs when the researcher takes the survey responses and puts them into a specific format so the data can be analyzed. This format will look differently based on whether it's qualitative or quantitative data that's collected, and we'll cover this more in depth in the later video lectures in this module. All right, well, that completes this lecture video. Thanks for watching, everyone.